Okay? This is the beginning of a 5-week series on the book of Ruth, and I thought I'd start by showing you a picture of what Ruth looks like. The one on the left has a heart there, which is significant to the book of Ruth. So Ruth had a good heart, and you'll find that out when we study it. So we'll probably have a picture of her, different pictures each week, just to start out the study. So you get to know what Ruth is like. So the book of Ruth is a story of love, devotion, and redemption. It shows the love and devotion which Ruth and Naomi had for one another, as well as the mutual love and devotion shared by Ruth and Boaz. It's also a very wonderful example of God's providence, and you'll see that as we go through it. I just want to make sure I'm not used to looking up here, and so I'll turn around and look. So these are just thought starter questions to get the brain going a little bit. It's one of the only 2 books in the Bible which are named after women. Ruth, and what's the other one? Esther. Ruth was a blank woman and not an Israelite, a Moabite. Ruth was the great-grandmother of David, King David. Ruth is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. The historical events recorded in the book of Ruth transpired either in blank or in the land of blank.
Moab or Judah.
Okay. These events took place during the days when the blank ruled. Judges ruled. Okay, you guys aced that, so we don't have to go any farther. I had a class in college where they gave a pre-test, and if you aced it, you didn't have to go through the class. You had to show up to take the final, but you didn't have to come every day. So there is a whole lot more to Ruth than what those questions are. So I do encourage you to come each week. Okay, let's start with just the first verse. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Of course, some of our questions already answered those, but there's a whole lot to just that first verse, because it describes the setting, it describes why they left. And to get a better understanding, I think we need to delve into some of those things a little bit more. Just what was going on, because anytime you study, you want to ask yourself, what is the message that Jesus or that God wanted us to have? I mean, everything's there for a purpose, right? So what's the purpose of it? So we want to ask that, and we want to ask it here also. So obviously it starts out in the days when the judges ruled. So what does that mean? Does that mean anything to you?
It's a time of disorganization and just lawlessness.
Yep.
Apostasy.
Exactly.
Just a disaster for
Exactly.
Israelites in the land.
Exactly. And we're going to go through that a little bit more. We're not going to study the book of Judges, but we want to understand what was going on during that time. Of course, this was after the Israelites crossed the Jordan River with Joshua, and each tribe took over specific areas of Canaan. And so this is after that period. Where did the story occur? That was Bethlehem of Judah. Why did the family move? Because of a famine, that's correct. Now, we don't know, it doesn't say, but I think I want to revisit that very question as we go through the book of Judges, and you see the cycles that they went through. And you have to ask yourself, was God involved in this? And we also want to think about, as we go through this, compare it to life today. What's going on today? How long did they say they were to go there, to Moab? You might miss this because it doesn't say a lot about it, but it gives you an indication. And you can't skip that. What does it say for how long they planned to go to Moab? A while. That implies not forever, right?
Right. But
If
it
you
doesn't imply a real short time either.
Right. It doesn't imply that they were going for a year or 6 weeks. They went to Florida for 4 weeks. That would be a while,
Yeah.
possibly. But they did, in other words, they didn't know how long they were going to be gone.
Right.
And it's due to the famine. So they had to leave. And so they went to the country of Moab. We want to look a little bit more at what happened in Judges, and we also want to understand a little bit more about Moab. This is an eye chart, so I decided to put 2 of them on there so you could have 2 eye charts. The first,
One for the left and one for the right eye, right?
yeah. I don't know if you can see up in the corner, obviously not. But the first one is, it just shows the 12 tribes of Israel. And this was basically after Joshua, and they divided up the land amongst the tribes. Well, that's pretty close to the second one. The only difference with the second one is you see the little white boxes. Those are all the different judges. And it's not to study who the judges are or what they did, but just to know that those are the areas, different areas that the judges were in. And so they were all over in different areas. Some of them at the same time, some of them not at the same time. About how long was this period? Does anybody know? Close to 400 years, 350, 400 years. Joshua leads Israel to conquer the promised land, then parcels out the territories to the 12 tribes, and then in Judges, Israel enters a cycle of turning from God, falling captive to oppressive nations, calling out to God, and being rescued by leaders that God sends their way, called judges. What did the Israelites not do when they took over the lands that caused problems?
They didn't drive out the enemy,
They didn't drive out the enemy.
which was crucial.
That was very crucial. And why did God want them to drive out the enemy?
So they wouldn't serve the gods of the enemy. They would worship idols and pull away from God.
Okay, so they wouldn't serve the idols and the other gods. And that was a problem. And then they started to intermarry.
They had a tremendous influence on the Israelites.
So they not only didn't drive them out, but they started to intermarry with them, which means they started to worship their idols, which caused more problems. Okay, there's couple of them that are going to be the same. This shows the cycles of sin, and you can't read it very well. And I'm going to go to the next one because it's the same. You'll see these, you can look at different studies and they'll show you different cycles. This one had more, that's why I chose that. And I'll read it starting clockwise at 12 o'clock. It says, the nation served God, then they did evil. They turned away from God. They followed their own way, their own pleasures. They were defeated by the enemy. In slavery, they were put into slavery. Serving other gods, they cried out to God. Then they turned to God. They repented and turned from sin, and God raised up a judge for them. And God delivered his people in. Typically until that judge died, and then they would go back into the same cycle again. And they did this over and over and over for 350 to 400 years. Now remember, this was the time during the span that Ruth occurs. It's a contrast between the cycles of sin that was going on and what happens in the book of Ruth. And so again, you got to ask, what's the message from God? If you couldn't read those, I know you can't read this one, so I'm going to go past it. These are the oppressors during the time of Judges. I won't go through all of those, and it shows the name of the judges, but they were oppressed by the different kingdoms around them because they were allowing these people to live amongst them and allowing their people to intermarry with them. I have a lot of eye charts, so I hope you don't blame me for having to get a new prescription. This particular one, I don't want to show you anything except the first column shows the name of the judges. The second one shows the tribe that they were from. And the third one shows the years. And you can see, if you can read it, which you can't, but you can read it good enough to understand there's a wide range of years that each judge judged. And so it ranges from 3 years up to 80 years for any given judge. So that's the main purpose of that chart. And that you understand that the judges didn't all serve the same amount of time because the cycles didn't all take the same amount of time. And some of them, as you can see in the next chart, and I don't expect you to read the details there, but you can read the numbers at the top, roughly 1350 down to about 1000, which is when Samuel was done. Samuel overlaps with Saul there, you can see.
It was obvious there when he started. That's pretty, not too long after they got into Canaan. So God intended to lead them, leadership would come through judges.
Yes. Yeah, you can, it started almost right away. If you start reading the book of Judges in the first 2 chapters, you'll see very quickly the problem that was occurring. And we won't go through that because we probably need a whole class on the book of Judges. And that would probably be a long 12-week class minimum. So the next two verses kind of sum it up, the problem. So first one, Judges 21:25 is right. It's near the end of Judges. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. On mine, I underlined, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, because the problem wasn't that they didn't have a king. They wanted a king, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
How soon did they lose the law or parts of the law? Because we know later on that they discover the law and they say that we haven't been obeying this for generations. I forget how long. But so was the law lost during the time of the judges, I believe, right?
Yes.
And do we know when that was?
Well, the next verse I have there kind of indicates a little bit. That's in Judges 2:10, which is very early in the book of Judges. Very shortly, in fact, Joshua dies in chapter 1, and this occurs in chapter 2. It says, another generation arose after them. The first generation, I believe it talks about how they intermarried, or at least how they started worshiping other gods. And that was a problem. And God was upset with them. And here in 2:10 it says, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. And so it says that generation did not know the Lord.
Right.
So obviously it was very, very quickly.
That didn't take long.
And it didn't take long. So what's that kind of imply? What's it imply to our world today?
Yeah.
What is it? What's our responsibility towards our children?
Teach them the Word of God.
Teach them the Word of God. What didn't occur in Judges? They didn't. They were too busy worried about what was right in their own eyes. They were worried about themselves.
Same problem we got today.
Same problem we have today. Well, if you think about it, and as we go through the book of Ruth, I hope that you understand that that applies to us today also. And it says that during this time of cycle, this other thing occurred, the story of Ruth. And so that says in our lives, even though we have times of trouble, and we're going through stuff that our country's going through, with the abortions, with everything that is sinful, good can come out of that. Okay, the next one was they went to Moab. So we want to understand a little bit about Moab and the Moabites. They lived in the highlands east of the Dead Sea, now what's called Central Jordan, and flourished in the 9th century BC. Their culture is dated by scholars from about the late 14th century BC to 582 BC. And that's when, according to Jewish historian Josephus, they were conquered by the Babylonians. And also that's roughly when they ceased to exist as a country and a nation. And the Moabites were pretty much wiped out at that time. I would guess any of them remaining would have assimilated into whatever country either they were captured and taken to or wherever. So, but there were no Moabites after that point in time.
And you know, that 582 is about the same time that Babylon came in and raised Jerusalem and
Yes,
took Israel into captivity.
yes. Genesis 19:30 through 38 says the Moabites belong, this is paraphrasing, they belong to the same ethnic stock as the Israelites. Their ancestral founder was Moab, who was the son of Lot, one of the sons of Lot, who was a nephew of the Israelite patriarch Abraham. So the Moabites and the Israelites are related somewhat.
I don't know if you were going to mention this or not, but the Moabites also were the people that Israel, coming out of Egypt, came upon, and actually, they would have intermarried with the Moabites when they went through that land. And
When they came up out of Egypt, they would have.
yes,
Yeah.
and so Ruth came out of that same area
Mm-hmm.
that Israel had stopped and could have made a big mistake.
So you kind of have to understand a little bit about what Ruth's background was. And we'll study, we're not going to get into that trip over there yet until next week. But you have to kind of think, what was Ruth's background as a Moabite? Which is going to say a lot about Naomi. Some more about Moab, or the Moabites. Their god was Shamash, if I pronounce that right. Very little is known about him, except we do know that King Saul of Israel in the 11th century fought against the Moabites, and you can read about that in Samuel, 1 Samuel, who later granted asylum to the family of the young rebel and future King David in 1 Samuel 22, 3 through 4. David in turn fought against the Moabites and forced them to pay heavy tribute. One of the other things, King Solomon of Israel built a sanctuary to him east of Jerusalem. That's in 1 Kings 11, verse 7. The shrine was later demolished by King Josiah, 2 Kings 23:13. Now, we just talked about judges and how they went into a cycle and started worshiping other gods. Here they have a king, which they wanted. And what did King Solomon do? He built a shrine.
Now, do you have a number of good judges versus bad?
No, I remember reading on it, but I can't
Okay,
I can't
I haven't
remember.
done that either.
But there were both good judges and bad judges, which shows you God can use a person, whether they're good or bad, to do his will.
Same way with the king. You had
Right.
the good and the bad.
Right.
Now, I didn't have any good ones of the northern tribes, but you had good ones of the southern tribes. But you had bad.
There's a Moabite stone that was discovered in, I think it was, I can't remember the date now. It was either the late 1800s or early 1900s, and I can't remember exactly when it was. But this stone indicates the possibility that Shamash and Moloch were the same god. We don't know for sure. It's speculation, but it indicates that. It says, since it speaks of Shamash as the god of the Ammonites, while Moloch is elsewhere their god, it talks about him being the god of the Ammonites. So this could be the same god, different languages, maybe. This Moabite stone was dated around 840 BCE, or before Christ. It contained a significant Canaanite inscription, and in the name of King Mesha of Moab. And so that stone didn't occur until 840, which was after the book of Ruth. You know, when you're studying some of this stuff, you kind of find stuff that's very interesting, and it pulls you off in the weeds, and it lengthens your study, but you find out a lot of different things. The individual that discovered this was a missionary from Germany, or from France. His name was, I can't remember whether it's Frederick Augusta or Augusta Frederick Klein, which he's from Strasbourg, France, which was about 40 miles from where my ancestors came from in Baden-Baden. So could be relation, who knows? I really doubt it. But. David's great-grandmother Ruth was a Moabite, which we've also already talked about, and his son Solomon, as a sign of his authority, Solomon obtained Moabite princesses for his harem. Of course, then he erected the shrine for him. The Moabite language differs only in dialect from the Hebrew. But, so they were very closely related, but the Moabites were excluded from Jewish community. Deuteronomy 23, 3-6 talks about this, where the name of Moab is typically designated for the enemies of God. And I don't know if you guys picked up a handout. There's a handout that I put back here that it's really not for this week, but I do want to point out in that chart that's there, Bethlehem is called the house of bread, and Moab is the land of sin and death, which pretty much matches what this said. It was the enemies of God. So it's very similar. So you can imagine that there was some conflict between Moab and Israel. It went back and forth. I want to show you this. You might see enough of this map. There's actually two again. You have to ask yourself, what route did they take? It could have been around the Dead Sea, because Moab is there. That river that flows east of the Dead Sea is the Arnon River. Moab is just south of that. Now, they could have taken the northern route, or they could have taken the southern route, where it has the wilderness of Edom. And so, it's some interesting stuff here. This shows the King's Highway. If they went either the north route or the south route, they may have had to go there because the mountains were pretty treacherous. I'll show you some pictures of those just so you know it. It wasn't a walk in the park to get there. I don't know, Mike, did you guys get over on that side?
No, we were forbidden.
That's Jordan, so you couldn't go over there.
So we could not go over there, but we looked over there.
You looked over there? Could you see the mountains from where you're at?
Yeah, you could.
Okay. Interesting, I was looking through different maps, and I found a map of the Arabian oil pipeline. It runs roughly right along where that highway, or where the King's Highway is. King's Highway it's there today, and it was there back then. I'm sure it wasn't asphalt like it is today, but.
Now, did I understand, you weren't sure whether they went in from the south or came in from the north?
There's no indication whether they
I
went in
think they
from...
came in from the south. Now, whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know, but the reason I do is because the conflict they had with Moab and Moab's to the south. And they had that conflict before they went in to Canaan.
Right, right.
But that,
In fact, in some of the different timelines, we don't really know what the timeline is for the book of Ruth as far as how it fits into Judges. There's some speculation that they would have probably went into Moab when relations were better and not when they were worse, but we don't know that for sure. I'm going to skip that one. I'll go to this one. This is the King's Highway. You can see it's not, if you had to walk that, that'd be pretty rough. Well, it gets even rougher than that. And it would take some time. This would be from the south. Even that is not easy.
well, that takes you through Samaria.
This would take you down probably around where Sodom and Gomorrah were. Down around. Now, how far they had to go, whether they stayed along the edge of the water, I don't know. It's tough to find what the terrain is all around there, but there are some steep cliffs, and it would probably be pretty tough to get through without going inland some. Since the King's Highway is inland, they probably would have had to go to traverse that area. Now, this is south of Bethlehem, and this would have been along the southern route. Right in here, this is probably not too bad if they followed that valley through there. Oops. Wrong button. Now, this is probably the mountains that you may have seen from the other side. And this is the Moab Mountains along the Dead Sea. So you can see they rise up pretty high. And I talked about the Arnon River, which is right here. And so if they came in from the south, this is a pretty desolate area right in here. But if they came in from the north, it's pretty rough terrain. So either way, I don't think it was that easy to get there. This is a picture that's of a dam that's on the Arnon River. It's about 70 miles east of the Dead Sea, just to give you an idea of the terrain. Now, if they came in from the north and they went to Moab, they would have had to cross that somewhere.
Is that a dam?
That is a dam.
Generating electricity there?
Yeah, there's a lake behind it, and it's the lowest dam in the world. It's sea level because the Dead Sea is the lowest area. This is some more. This is the Arnon River as it flows into the Dead Sea. You can see back where that arrow's at. Whoops. Right in there, that's the Dead Sea back in there. And I don't know which way this other one is, but that's the Arnon River Gorge, which I don't know how they would traverse that. And then the next one's also another picture that shows you. Now, when they get there, they may have had an area like that, and that's why they went. So they could have food to eat. So look, I guess the whole point of showing you those It's just to understand that when this family went there, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into the specific names of the family, and you start to understand that. We'll talk about that a little bit next week. But I want you to keep in mind what this area looked like, and as they traveled there, what they probably went through. Though the period of Judges was a dark period in Israel's history, the book of Ruth clearly shows that there also were some godly people living at that time. The main message of the book of Ruth centers around these three characters, Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. Ruth was a gentlewoman from Moab who married the son of Naomi. Naomi was Ruth's first mother-in-law. And Boaz, a kinsman of Naomi's husband, who married Ruth later on. So that's very, very brief, but it's during this time of Judges when they had this cycle that they went through was this family. And I just want to bring about, I'm going to kind of cheat and go a little bit early, but Naomi's husband's name was Elimelech. That's on, if you have your handout, it's on there. And his nickname was My God is King. Which kind of tells you a little bit about him, because the names back then were a reflection of the people. Sometimes God named somebody, but other times the family named them. And it wasn't just a name that the mother or father liked because it sounded good like sometimes we have today. These names meant something about that person.
Don't you wonder how they picked out names for their children that described their character, and yet they hadn't seen their character yet?
Don't know.
But it happened.
Yeah. We're going to go through these names a little bit more later on, and we'll revisit them as we go through the book of Ruth. You'll see some slight, if you read different things that translate those and tell you what their names mean, you might see a slight variation, but this is what's on this paper is a general meaning. And so if you didn't pick up a handout, please do so. It has some questions on it. I want you to think about as we go through the next 4 weeks and study. It's to prod your mind and think, for example, the first one is what lessons can we observe from the life and conduct of those three people? Considering that they were living through the period of Judges.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a comment, just as an observation here. It could be that when they named their children, that was setting expectations for both the parent and the child, which they may have been talking about. And so that became, in other words, the child became what was expected. And it may say something to us today. How do we name our children? What expectations do we put out there for them? And do they grow into them?
Well, it may also say that sometimes maybe the names change to describe the person later.
Yeah.
Because, for example, one of Naomi's children is Mahalon, which means sick or sickly.
Yeah.
It's probably not a name you would name your child, hoping that they grow into that.
Into sickness.
So it's probably more a description of what they were like as they grew. We're going to talk about those names quite a bit more, so that's why I gave them to you, because I want you to think about it as we go through the study.
Hey, Gary,
Yeah.
a little irony there in the first verse is The name of the town, Bethlehem, it means house of food.
House of food,
So
or
they're having a famine in the house of food.
that's right. It's house of food or house of bread, either one. And they're having a famine in the house of bread, which is, you kind of wonder where was the cycle and what was going on and what caused the famine.
You're right.
It could have very well been who they were being oppressed by, and they could have done something that caused the famine. Or, who knows, it could have been they're so far gone that God said, I got to do something about this.
It may have been the description of our Lord, where he was born and prophesied to be born there, and he became the bread of life.
I think that's very important to understand what all has happened in Bethlehem and how that fits into this story. We'll go through that a little bit more as we go on, but thanks, that's a good point. There are quite a few things that have happened in Bethlehem, not only before that, after that, and even to this day. What was it that happened in, I think it was 2002 or 2004? When they bombed, or when the Palestinians went into the church and took over the church, and there was a standoff between Israel, and that caused a lot of, was that in 2000? Maybe it was 2008. I can't remember now. I'll have to look it up and I'll bring that in next week. But we got a little bit more to go. That is the first bell, correct?
Yes.
Okay. The book of Ruth is a love story. I'm going to skip that one. That's the one that's on your handout. It's a love story, shows devotion and redemption. It shows the love and devotion which Ruth and Naomi gave for one another, as well as the mutual love and devotion shared by Ruth and Boaz. It is set in a distressing time of the age of Judges and presents a foreign woman, a Moabitess named Ruth, who forsakes her pagan kinsman in order to remain faithful to her covenant relationship with her husband's people. It's a story that begins in poverty, famine, and despair, and ends at the throne of David. And the story of Ruth and the kinsman redeemer is a very important story to understand. And so you have to ask, God used a foreign woman to come in and do his will. And so he's telling us something right there. His will is not just for the Israelites. He wants others to be part of it too, and he even used them.
And God has a habit throughout history of working with the humble.
That's right. The book of Ruth is written for the people of Judah, as well as us today. Judah was the name of Jacob's fourth son and one of the 12 tribes. And I'm going to skip through that, the rest of that. I'm going to skip through that. I want to get to this part of it. I want to show you where the book of Ruth is involved in Jewish religion. There's 3 divisions in the Hebrew Bible: the Torah, I'll probably butcher these names, the Neviim and the Ketuvim. And of course the Torah is what? It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the middle portion of their Bible goes through the prophets and also the 4 historical works that are listed there. And then the third part has Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, and a collection that's what is known as the 5, anybody know how to pronounce that? Megilliots. If I go through it fast enough, maybe that's convincing enough. So basically they're scrolls. And they're scrolls of each one of those books. They've been grouped together according to the annual cycle of their public reading in the synagogue. It also includes the books of Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So the book of Ruth is very specific in that it is one of 5 scrolls that are part of the Ketuvim, or the writings, the last third of the Hebrew Bible. It's traditionally read in the synagogue on Shavuot, I believe is how that's pronounced. Does anybody know what Shavuot is?
No, I kept going to ask.
Did you talk about that last week, Mike?
Not last week.
Or a couple weeks ago, maybe?
Is it Passover? No. What is?
Well, it's 50 days after Passover.
Oh, Pentecost.
So it occurs at the same time as Pentecost. Basically, the Hebrews may have called it Pentecost. It's not the same Pentecost that some Christian churches celebrate, although it is at the same time. So the next slide I want to go to shows you why they read this. In traditional settings, the book of Ruth is read on the second day of Shavuot. The book is about, of course, I'm not going to read that part of it. This is basically in Leviticus 23:15 through 22, talks about the Festival of Weeks. This is what that is. It's a Jewish holiday. It's the day after. This is what Leviticus says, and I'm kind of paraphrasing this. It's a day after Sabbath. It says to count 7 full weeks, or count off 50 days up to the day after the Sabbath. The priest set an offering of new grain to the Lord. So it's an offering of grain. Well, what's the book of Ruth about? So that's possibly one of the reasons why they read the book of Ruth during that time. I just have a couple more. This might be my last one. So, yeah. There are many explanations given for reading Ruth on this holiday. The most quoted reason is that Ruth coming to Israel took place around the same time. Her acceptance to the Jewish faith was comparable or likened to the acceptance of the Jewish people of God's Torah, the law. The second explanation relates to genealogy, since the book of Ruth ends with the genealogy of David, whose forebearer Ruth was. It has been suggested that it was read on Shavuot because there was a legend that David died then.
That David what?
That David died on that
day?
On that day. I don't know. That's the Hebrew legend. Another reason is for the reading of Ruth on Shavuot is that the story takes place at harvest time, which occurs during the spring harvest, which is when she came back. And so I was reading one thing, I can't find it, but It was a Jewish that was writing about the book of Ruth, and they were talking about how it talked about David's genealogy. And of course, you know that the genealogy that's in there is the same, exact same one that's in Matthew, up to David. And this writer, who was Jewish, also said that they thought, when they read the book of Ruth, that it was pointing towards the Messiah. So, it makes you wonder why the Jews didn't understand that. When here they read it every year,
Yep.
and they thought about those things, why they still rejected him. So, anyway, is there any questions? Okay, we will continue next week, starting in chapter 1. Thank you.